So, just for starters, could you please give me an overview what your book, the Preserving Memory book, of course. Oh, before I begin,
Yeah.
I just want to preface it. I found in interviewing people, I take things from the 15 years ago you wrote this book. So if I throw some quote at you, you may not remember it.
No, I'll remember it.
Pardon?
I'll remember it.
Oh, okay, because some people the context is out and all that, but I just want to sometimes just throw it out
Sure.
and see where you go with it. So please, okay. In overview, could you discuss this book? What is the book about, and what led you to it, to this investigation?
Well, I had finished a book in 1991 called Sacred Ground, Americans and Their Battlefields, and was looking for a new major project to work on. And a very good friend of mine, John Roth, who was a very good friend of Michael Berenbaum, who was at that time project director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It was in its embryonic stages at that time, said, well, you should go and talk to Michael and see about writing a biography of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. So I went back in the spring of 1991 and, make a long story short, eventually had permission to spend a tremendous amount of time with the people and the archives of the museum, such as they were. The project was underway, and it was really a historian's dream because I had access to everything and to everybody in those very intense and fascinating years until the museum opened in 1993, and then following that for another, well over a year, and the book was published in 1995. So the book really is a biography of one of the most celebrated, in some ways controversial, significant museums in American history. How does the Holocaust belong as an American memory? Where does it belong? What kind of institution should house such a memory? And those are issues that dealt with everything from what city, what kind of institution, what kind of architecture, what kind of story, who gets to make these decisions. So it was an incredibly interesting story to tell, and a book that made a profound impact upon me.
And what was your response to the book? You mentioned the media were floating around back then.
Oh, well, I promised the museum that I would not write anything about the museum until it was open, because while I had access to everything, it seemed to me unethical and completely unfair to an institution that trusted me with lots of, with everything that was there, to write an op-ed or to do something that would in fact affect the process of opening the museum itself. The opening in the museum generated worldwide publicity. When my book came out, which was 2 years after the museum opened, there was a significant amount of media interest, so I did a fair amount of radio and television, and traveled all over the country talking about the book, and really enjoyed doing all of that because it was such an exciting project to work on, and I could talk about the museum in a way that very few people, except for a few people at the museum, could. One of the things that made me most proud was that after the book came out, Sheike Weinberg, the late Sheike Weinberg, who was the director of the museum, wrote me a wonderful letter saying how good the book was, and that I had done a good job in conveying the story. And without Sheike, I could never have even done the project, so it meant a lot to me.
The book touches on a lot of interesting things. One thing you make reference to the official Holocaust memory of the nation, us. So how would you define America's, quote, official memory of the Holocaust? And in that context, please, what were the debates about why it should or shouldn't be on the mall?
Well, I was very interested when I when I tried to get grant money, because I was going back and forth from Wisconsin to Washington and to New York, and then a trip to Eastern Europe all the time, and I needed grant money, and almost no Jewish granting organizations would give me any money. And I thought, well, this is strange. Certainly everybody is on board with this project. What I learned was that this was a very controversial project among American Jews. Some felt that this was a European memory and really didn't belong in America, that focusing on the Holocaust instead of the rich history of American Judaism meant that people really only paid attention to Jews in the way that they died, right? A kind of pornographic attention to death, and that this was an unhealthy focus. Others thought that the museum project would take away lots of other money from small Jewish museums. Others thought that the money that was going to the museum should be spent at that time on supporting the emigration of Soviet Jews who, were being persecuted so much. On the other side of that philosophical divide were people who said, look, Americans were in World War II. Americans came home from confronting and liberating the camps. This is a part of American memory, right, in the way now that other parts of World War II are American memory. We need to tell this story. We need to understand what happens when democracy breaks down and anti-Semitism, racism, genocide rear their head. This is exactly the kind of story that should be told. So there were these divides about this, and it impacted, I think, what was the story that you wanted to tell, and where should you do it? If this was a purely Jewish museum, well, then you pick a place like New York or LA. But if it's to be an American museum, Washington was seen clearly as a place that the museum should be. There were 12 or 13 different sites in Washington thought about. This site eventually, for a variety of reasons, was chosen. And for those who believed that to counter Holocaust deniers, murderers of memory, that the United States would officially recognize that the Holocaust happened. And this was tremendously significant, especially to survivors, who realized that they were aging and soon there would not be any survivors. And they worried, perhaps more than they needed to, that the voices of deniers would be stronger and more mainstream. I have a hard time believing that will ever happen. Nevertheless, for them, the fact that this would be a United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, not just a Jewish museum, was tremendously important. That this was a kind of eternal insurance policy that the United States said the Holocaust took place.
So that's what's inferred by official memory?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Could you address, again, forgive me, Elie
Wiesel.
Elie Wiesel. His influence was profound, and there's a lot of impact he had on this. Could you discuss?
Well, Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, Nobel laureate, certainly one of the most famous survivors in the world, who had become really a sacred figure in American culture by that time through his writing, through his presence, through his teaching. Led the President's Commission on the Holocaust, which was formed by President Carter in 1978. And this was a group that was tasked with, how does the United States remember the Holocaust? They traveled to Eastern Europe to go to the camps. It was fascinating to read about the trips, about how these people thought about the United States and the Holocaust. They made a report to President Carter in the Rose Garden in 1979. One of the recommendations was an institution that would house Holocaust memory in some way. Elie Wiesel then became, chair of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. And he was very significant in this process because the survivors sort of trusted him with their stories and trusted him to represent them, that the Holocaust would be represented and told in this institution with an integrity of memory, that the Jewish core of the Holocaust would be sacred. So he was a tremendously significant figure in this whole period. He stepped down from the council in 1987, but surely the years that he spent were very, very important ones.
Okay, could you discuss some of the specifics of his perspective? For example, the idea that this is from you, the idea that it's a sacred institution entrusted with the mystery of the Holocaust, all that sort of stuff.
Well, here's one of the ways in which doing a museum like this, that for survivors, families, and others, this is not a secular institution. It is a sacred institution. It is first and foremost a symbolic burial place for those who went up in ashes. It's a place where memory of the Holocaust, with the center of it being the Jewish genocide in the Holocaust, was sacred, and that any dilution of that was seen as a transgression of Holocaust memory. Well, when you have an institution being built, you have to decide, well, where are the bathrooms going to be, and what's the lighting going to be, and how do we preserve certain kinds of artifacts, and indeed, what artifacts do we even want to preserve? And if it's a United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, what's the relationship between Jews and so-called other victims of the Holocaust? The pluralistic imperative was built into this from day one. So how do you preserve the Jewish core, but also do justice to others who were not Jewish and not sort of relegate them to byproducts of Nazi death? Now, even before dealing with those issues of representation, though, membership on the United States Holocaust Memorial Council was very, very controversial. What about representatives from Eastern European nations whose people, both citizens, both murdered Jews and were persecuted by the Nazis? This was a very volatile situation. And so just that issue of who sits at the table, who gets to make these kinds of decisions was very, very, very difficult. The very definition of the Holocaust, is it just 6 million? Is it 6 million plus 5 million non-Jews? Is it 11 including 6? Is it just 11? This was a slippery slope that Elie Wiesel saw might take place, where Jews just became a kind of invisible, larger part of a larger number. And this members of the Commission saw when they went to Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, where socialist countries really didn't talk about Jews at all in their memorialization. So this issue of the relationship between Jews and other Holocaust victims ran throughout the entire project, and the nature of the building and the nature of the membership of the Commission and the Council, certainly in the formation of the permanent exhibition in the museum. This was a razor's edge all the way through.
There's a million subjects here, and I want to get to
Sure.
more of them. But one of the things that you're alluding to, I think, is that this notion of particularism, the Jewish particularism, versus as somehow informing a universality. Could you that's implicit? It sounds like a paradox, but could you address the kind of logic that informs that?
Well, Adolf Hitler and National Socialism, the Jews were certainly at the center of their demonization. And I mean, Hitler was a phobic anti-Semite and a hater of Jews, in a way I think qualitatively different from how others would register as less than human in the murderous worldview of the Nazis. So to ignore the centrality of Jews as Holocaust victims, it seems to me would be both a moral failing and a historical perversion. But there were lots of non-Jews who were victims, depending upon where you put the boundary of the Holocaust. I mean, where's the boundary of the Holocaust versus people murdered by the Nazis? Were millions of Russian prisoners of war victims of the Holocaust? Well, it depends where you draw the line. What about the mentally retarded, victims of the T4 program? which began before large-scale mass murder of Jews? What about religious, Catholics and Protestants? What about non-Jewish Poles who are portrayed stunningly in the museum, in the way that the Nazis simply wiped out virtually anybody that they deemed any kind of a threat in Poland at all: teachers, doctors, lawyers, religious folks. So where do you draw those boundaries, and what is the balance, and what is the relationship? What about gypsies? These were issues that were not solved by the museum, but were engaged by the museum, and these are still issues that that people struggle with and write about today. Is the Holocaust unique, for example? A problematic term for any historian. Well, of course, it's unique in some ways. It's not unique in other ways. If it is, as one writer said, uniquely unique, so divorced from history that nothing else is even close to it, well, then there is nothing that we have to learn from it, which is not the purported mission of the Holocaust Museum or Holocaust education, right? It's that this is an event that is a miner's canary in a lot of ways, that it is an eruption in the middle of World War II that is its own thing, but it is not. The perpetrators and the bystanders and the victims of the Holocaust were human beings. This was not something that demons did. This was something that human beings did. It was something that human beings suffered. It was something that human beings have tried to engage all throughout these years. As Terence DePrey, who wrote wonderfully about Holocaust literature, a phrase that has stuck with me all these years, and I tell my students in my Holocaust and American Memory class, what we are dealing with still is the predicament of aftermath. What do we do with this? And I think that if you ever come to a point where there is not that about the Holocaust, at which you just sit back in awe, fear, despair, challenge, then it's time to worry.
Could you discuss it's almost religiosity of this perspective, that the Holocaust could never be understood, it transcended history, all that stuff?
Yes, and I have my own sort of sense about that. I understand and respect, particularly as someone born into a community of American Jews, the sense of this as a sacred boundary, not to be trivialized, not to be saccharinized at all, but it is a human event, and parts of it have to be understood, bumped up against as best we can. We need to try to understand the motivations, the actions of the perpetrators. We need to understand the complexity of Jewish life in the ghettos and in the camps. We need to understand how civilian populations engaged in all kinds of complex ways with this event in many, many, many different countries. We need to try and understand the levels of memory that people have struggled with all these years. To simply say that this is a mystery, and of course at some level this eruption of evil has to be a mystery. There has to be that point where you just sit back and silence is the best response. But it can't be the only one, because we are tasked as historians with trying, even if it's ultimately futile, to understand the power of evil and how it works in the world. I think I think that's a moral imperative. So simply to say, this is a mystery, we'll never understand it, to remove it from history, to my mind, does not allow us to engage with the humanness of evil and the humanness of the Holocaust. This was not a nightmare. It wasn't a bad dream. It wasn't a bad trip. When you go to the camps in Poland, these are real places, and there are birds and flies and noises and ground and sky. Real people lived there, real people killed there, real people died there. We cannot avoid our responsibility to understand as best we can this genocide, to write about it, to cry out against it, in my case, disciplined historical narratives, and to raise the question again and again, if never again means anything, why in the hell have there been so many genocides since then? And why haven't we done much about them? This, of course, is one of my despairing takes on the Holocaust. Is it seems to me that one of the real ways that the memory of the Holocaust has lived on is in the murderous visions of purification that many leaders have had in many different countries. And unfortunately, never again, to my mind, has become a kind of mindless intensifier that has very little body to it.
Could I intercede 1 second and move this? So is part of what you're saying, as a historian, is part of the issue to attempt to understand why it happened, why the Holocaust happened? I mean, as opposed to making it transcendent.
Well, if you look at how the museum is organized in their permanent exhibition, and it is a narrative, it's a story that you follow from the first floor to the second floor. One of the things that I respect about the museum is that it tries to set a historical context for the Holocaust. The fourth floor deals with the rise of National Socialism. The Holocaust didn't drop out of the sky. It didn't just plop down on Earth. It emerged out of a number of complex strands of European history. One of them, of course, being anti-Semitism, the long history of anti-Semitism. One of them being World War I, right? On and on. So there's a whole tangle of events that don't explain the Holocaust, but say, okay, it's in this context of all of these narrative threads that the Holocaust becomes the Holocaust. World War II had something to do with it, of course, right? The Holocaust emerges in World War II, and there's historians still write tremendous amounts of new stuff on, well, okay, how did this evolve? Was this the plan from the beginning? Did the process of destruction emerge over a period of time, with events in World War II kind of the trigger? So to place the Holocaust in a variety of historical contexts does not diminish the horror of it. It says it's an event carried out by human beings, and we can at least point to, if not make, final pronouncements on this is how it came to be. And the museum does that very well, it seems to me, setting the stage for the most intense period of mass murder.
Could you address, please, the issue of the politics of Israel and all this? And you said you had an aside. It said you said it was expressed most crassly in a comment made to me that the museum was a way to remind congressmen how to vote on issues regarding the state of Israel. Can you discuss that?
One of the reasons that the President's Commission was formed, not the only one, but one of them was that the Carter administration, of course, had very problematic relationships with the state of Israel. The United States was also one of the few Western countries that did not have some kind of national memorial to the Holocaust. So here was a case where doing something that was seen as morally right was also something that was politically useful. The two went together. some people thought that the museum, when it came to be decided it would be in Washington and adjacent to the Washington Mall, that this was the main motivation for the museum, that it was a kind of sop to the state of Israel, a sop to the American Jewish community on the part of the Carter administration. I think that's overly cynical. I also think it's overly naive not to think that the politics of memory play a role in this, right? You can do something because it seems right to do, and it's also politically useful at the same time. This is clearly the case. When people go to Israel, when political figures go to Israel, cultural figures go to Israel, most of them go to Yad Vashem first, right? It's to remind them the stakes for the state of Israel, right, in terms of its existence. Now, people can say, look, this is a lesson learned too well. Every enemy is not the Nazis. Nevertheless, the power of the Holocaust is such that it can be wielded as a political weapon. So there was ambivalence in Israel at the time about the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum because Yad Vashem was really seen to be the kind of central, most significant museum to the Holocaust. And there was a kind of sense of competition with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Over time, there developed a very, I think, good and rich working relationship between the institutions. So there were certainly those who felt that there were crass political reasons for the making of the museum. I would include political reasons, but they are part of a larger leaven. I would certainly not say that that's the reason that the museum is there. That's just much too simple and much too cynical.
In that context, could you discuss your sense of Neusner's the Judaism of Holocaust and Redemption? That museum sort of played, you discussed it to some degree. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, yeah, Jack Neusner, who of course is a brilliant historian of religion, wrote very influentially, certainly for me, about why the Holocaust became a powerful narrative for American Jews. I mean, after all, here you have a community of Jews in the United States seemingly more free than anywhere else in the history of the world. Certainly anti-Semitism existed and still exists in the United States, but not in any deeply rooted, at least after World War II, deeply rooted and enduring institutional sense. There were still, of course, quotas here and there in universities and such, but these disappeared. So there was not that kind of murderous anti-Semitism existed. So why in the American Jewish community did the Holocaust become so central? And as Hasia Diner has shown in her new book, We Remember with Reverence and Love, she's really changed our understanding of the early years when the Holocaust was still very central to American Jews in all kinds of ways. In '67, with the Six-Day War, when it struck many American Jews that Israel could be wiped out, there was a sense that the Holocaust moved to the center of American Jewish identity. And Neusner's understanding of the Holocaust, of destruction and redemption, is this religious narrative that American Jews and others told. This move from destruction to redemption, with Israel being the point where the redemptive narrative begins. So it became a powerful sort of civic religious narrative in its own right that was part of the sacrality of the Holocaust, part of the sacrality of Holocaust survivors, seen as people who had experienced horrors, come back from those horrors and brought back with them, and this was the assumption, a kind of moral wisdom that we then granted them a sort of sacred status as survivor. And the term survivor then takes on a real moral power.
how does the, can you go a little deeper into that? How does the Holocaust inform a modern Jewish identity? You're hitting all over it, but is there any, you said sacrality, I mean the idea that there's a secular religion here?
Well, I think it was certainly a part of a secular religiosity of American Jews that many American Jews who do not consider themselves religious Jews in any way, for some anyway, the Holocaust was one way you could identify as a Jew, right? Had I been born in, or had my parents not emigrated from, and Peter Novick, of course, in his book *The Holocaust in American Life*, really takes this on critically, but it seems problematic, again, that an American Jewish community, with the kinds of religious freedoms that were here, with the kind of security in the United States, that the Holocaust would become a kind of central element of American Jewish identity is a curious phenomenon.
Could you address, you quote Yafa Eliach?
Yafa Eliach. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Cynical about the Shoah business, instant Judaizer, the Holocaust shocks people back into the Jewishness and all that. Could you discuss that attitude?
Yes, well, Yafa Eliach, of course, who was a wonderful historian at Brooklyn College and provided the material for the creation of the stunning Tower of Faces in the museum, and in the tower and in her writing brings back the destroyed village of Aishashak to life. Other people have used this term as well. There is no business like Shoah business, meaning the Holocaust, the Shoah, the destruction, like anything else, can be commercialized, can be trivialized, can be turned into something cheap, something tawdry. Some would say, not everyone, some would say, for example, that Holocaust, the miniseries in 1978 on NBC, interrupted by commercials and such, was a way of trivializing the Holocaust. Others would say, look, if you want the Holocaust not to be an insular memory of an ethnic community, as it moves out into popular culture, it will by definition take on some of the attributes of popular culture. And we're not going to be happy with all of those. So what she is saying is a danger not only with the Holocaust, but with any profound event or process. There's really nothing that can't be trivialized, commercialized, cheapened in some way by a popular culture. That's part of the price you pay when stuff goes this way. That's why the museum, why the people tasked with the creation of the museum, the intensity of their work, the fierce dedication to telling a horrific story respectfully, but keeping it horrific, was a way for them to maintain a kind of integrity of memory. And there were lots of issues that came, what kinds of photographs do you use and don't you use? And if you don't use certain ones because you're afraid people can't deal with them, well, then are you softening the story too much? So there's an example, right, of, well, where's the boundary between what people are willing to look at versus what has to be told? And those are difficult decisions to make.
I was there last week. I did a double take in the gift shop. There was a thing called the Holocaust Cookbook. That really threw me. Another quote from you, please.
Please.
Throw it out. Sociologist John Cudahy argued, this is what you're saying, argued that the Holocaust conferred the honor of supreme victim status upon American Jews, which often led to official compensatory gestures. American special relationship with Israel, for example. They used it, said Cudahy, as a secular form of chosenness in order to claim an attitude of moral superiority. Could you address that?
Well, yeah, Cudahy's critical statement there about the use of the Holocaust, of kind of cultural and political use of the Holocaust, was that it could infer a kind of negative chosenness, that the Holocaust is always the trump card that Jews have. Well, this other stuff is bad, but it's not Holocaustal, and that it could be used in ways that he found objectionable. And this was certainly a not uncommon critique of the political uses of Holocaust memory, and certainly was used in that way sometimes, but not always used in that way sometimes. So I think it's an interesting comment that certainly has credibility in some ways and at some times, but again is a small piece of a much, much larger and much richer understanding of the complex uses of the Holocaust. And if we think of what are the ways in which the Holocaust, memory of the Holocaust functions in different countries. Well, this is one of the ways, but there are so many others as well.
Can we go back a bit to this? You mentioned this bitter debates about this idea of 6 million Jews and the 5 million others, and Senator Wendell Anderson is involved in it and all that. Could you elaborate on those debates? Do you have any? Can you remember any examples of the kind of things that were going on?
Well, the debates were. This was in the early years of the commission. The latter part of the commission's work and the early part of the council. What's the definition of the Holocaust? And at one level, of course, well, it's easy, right? 6 million Jews and lots of other people were the victims of genocide, of mobile killing squads, of massacres in villages throughout Eastern Europe, of eventually the systematized, bureaucratized genocide in the Polish camps. But it wasn't so easy because the issue really had to do with how do you put together 6 million Jews and the number that Simon Wiesenthal had guesstimated 5 million other people. How do you put those together? Is it 6 million and 5 million others? Is it 11 million including 6 million Jews? Is it just 11 million in which Jews are invisible? And this got to the point where a Days of Remembrance ceremony, I believe it was 1980, was canceled at the White House because the definition, there was an argument over the grammatical connection between 6 million Jews and 5 million others. Was it going to be dashes that separated them or other grammatical usages that would kind of bring them more together? Now, at one level you think, good heavens, right? How can one, but the symbolic importance of this has to do with the tremendous fears of Elie Wiesel and others that there was a systematized attempt to efface the Jewish center of the Holocaust in many, many countries, and that this should not happen in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So this was the way that it was charged. It was charged in the permanent exhibition, right? Again, as you think about how you represent millions of Jews and millions of others. When you talk about the Holocaust as being unique, did Jews die a unique death? And what does that mean? So this was a struggle that played out over a tremendous number of areas.
Okay. In that context, you have a quote here. I'm going to throw it out, please, again. Yehuda Bauer and Monroe Friedman perceived different facets of traditional anti-Semitism at work. Bauer believed that the sudden desire among non-Jewish groups for a place in the national Holocaust memory revealed an envy of the Jews' privileged places first among victims and an unconscious reflection of anti-Semitic attitudes. Could you discuss that perspective? And how prevalent was that?
When it became clear that this was going to be a United States Holocaust Memorial project, lots of Eastern European ethnic national groups saw that there would be moral capital to be gained by being counted as victims of the Holocaust. People who hadn't given a damn about thinking of themselves as Holocaust victims before. But now, this recognition of being a victimized group along with Jews was seeing, well, this could gain us some moral or political capital. And so there became a very distasteful kind of competition of victimhood. Who got seats at the table at the Holocaust Memorial Council? People arguing, representatives of different groups, that their experiences were as unique as Jewish experience. And remember, this is at a time when the development of a kind of victim culture really is underway, maybe in its embryonic forms, when being a victim takes on a moral and a political importance, right? That there's an authority to being a victim. So this was a problem, and certainly could be seen as a competition among groups. And it wasn't just the Holocaust, it was also how far back in history do you go? One of the most controversial elements in the development of the museum was whether or not to include the Armenian genocide. There was an Armenian representative on the council from the beginning. There were a number of ways in which the Armenian genocide was represented in the museum. Some of those were taken out, only a few remain. And again, it was determined that extending the boundaries back to include the Armenian genocide went beyond the stated chronological boundaries of the museum, but also in a way diluted the focus on the Holocaust. Okay? Others argued that the Armenian genocide was, a kind of precursor in many ways, and was part of this genocidal impulse in the 20th century that should be a part of the museum. And it is there in a couple of places. Hitler's famous comment to some of his generals, who today remembers the Armenians, one or two other places, but it's you really have to know to look for it.
I have some quotes about that, the Armenian aspect, and one of the things you underscored was the politics of that in terms of Israel, and a lot of Jewish organized groups lobbied against that. Could you discuss the politics of this?
Well, for me, was one of the most interesting and troubling parts of the book. The Turkish embassy in Washington was greatly troubled by the thought that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum would mention the Armenian genocide, because Turkey has never agreed that there was an Armenian genocide. And there were some American Jews hired by the Turks and some Israeli groups who were willing to try to support that. Say, well, some people say there was, some people say there wasn't, which is stunning when one thinks about, Holocaust denial. There were people that there were American Jews, politicians, who supported the museum in Washington, who would not support Bob Dole's move for an Armenian Day of Remembrance in Congress. I found this terribly disheartening, in a number, that the integrity of memory did not extend this far. And this was very volatile and important stuff. I was told that there was someone in the Turkish embassy in the early 80s whose sole job it was to prevent the Armenian genocide from being mentioned in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. You know, the the integrity of memory comes up against realpolitik in any number of ways. And the Turks did tell President Carter, when he was going to say something about the Armenians at a Day of Remembrance ceremony, that there would be political complications between the United States and Turkey, a NATO ally, if he in fact mentioned them.
Hey, what was Israel's vested interest in this? Why were they, the politics, it's arrangements with Turkey or something?
There were political relationships with Turkey at stake. I don't remember exactly what they were.
How about gypsies? Now, you talk about gypsies, and they were one of the groups that were apparently left off the table in the beginning. Could you discuss?
Yeah, gypsies were, a gypsy representative, Roma or Sinti representative, was not, as I recall, a member of the commission, and not immediately on the council. The gypsies they were after some years, and there were some difficult relationships between people in the museum and gypsy representatives who felt that their representation as the permanent exhibition took shape was stereotyped, that they also were murdered for who they were and not for what they did. Elie Wiesel's sort of aphoristic solution for uniqueness, and that the genocide of the gypsies was not presented in the way that they would like to see it. And so they felt that they should be among the storytellers, not just among those whose story is told. So again, here's a fascinating issue of who gets to tell the story, who owns the means of representation, right? It's not just, yes, these people should be a part of the story that we tell, but who gets to sit at the table to shape and define the stories. So this was, for some years, a kind of ongoing tension with gypsy representatives.
And you mentioned Ukrainians were one of the groups that worked with the Nazis on one hand, were victimized also, and there was a lot of politics about that. Could you talk about them?
Well, Ukrainians and some other Eastern European groups, again, it was a very difficult situation where you had representatives of countries who both murdered Jews and were victimized by the Nazis sitting at the table with Jewish Holocaust survivors. And in some ways, it's a kind of a miracle that the council worked together as well as it did, because it was a very volatile situation.
You mentioned that there was a quote, a short-lived plan to have Israeli and American flags at the end of the exhibit. Could you address that, the politics of that, and how that came to be? Do you remember that? Or?
There's really not much to say about that. I know that the museum didn't want to connect genetically the Holocaust and the birth of Israel, right? As if, oh, well, yeah, the Holocaust was terrible, but Israel was born, right? So it was worth it, right? That kind of horrific understanding. I don't recall much about that. I'm sure Michael Berenbaum would be able to talk with you about that. I'm sure he would be able to.
All right, thank you. I'm going to try and look him up. You talk about Raoul Hilberg,
Mm-hmm.
and in the context of human hair in the exhibit, you say, as Raoul Hilberg once remarked, one of the problematic rules of Holocaust speech is that any survivor, no matter how inarticulate, is superior to the greatest Holocaust historian who did not share in the experience. Could you talk about that?
There were a number of examples, and this is an issue that goes beyond just the museum, but was certainly present in the museum. When do you honor the commemorative voice of witnesses, survivors who were there, who speak out of first-person authority, whose visceral memories are, escaping the ghetto or living through the camps? When do you honor those voices versus voices that sometimes can be in tension with those voices, the historical voices. People who were not there but are immersed in the paper trail, immersed in oral history, immersed in putting events in a much larger perspective. So there were several places in the development of the permanent exhibition when Sheike Weinberg, the director, had to make judgment calls on which of these voices to honor. For example, for well over a year, the argument over whether to display women's hair brought to the United States by the museum from Auschwitz. Hair shorn from women before they were gassed or sometimes kept alive and put to work, used by the Nazis for insulation in submarines, socks for the Wehrmacht and the German furniture industry. The hair would have been placed beneath a photo, which is there, of women shorn standing in front of the barracks, as an example of the utilization of people's bodies, in this genocidal process. It would have appeared on the third floor in the most intense part of the exhibition. For a long time, there was disagreement on the content committee. Survivors, museum professionals, and others who really were a kind of check on what was being done, right? And they voted 9-3 to display the hair. Several female survivors who had lost their families in the Holocaust made the argument that won the day. They said, that could be my mother. You can't display my mother in a museum. So at that point, Sheike had to decide whether to honor the commemorative sensibilities of survivors or the kind of voice of historians and museum professionals and display the hair. Now, this, to my mind, isn't really a matter of who's right and who's wrong. It's whose sensitivities do you honor and why in a particular situation. And this time, Sheike came down on the side of the survivors, that there was something personal, there was something visceral about the hair, that it was not displayed, is not displayed. There was another situation where he made the opposite decision, and this was an issue of photographs, right? I've said to you already that the museum was first and foremost a kind of sacred environment. Well, you don't defile a sacred environment with the presence of perpetrators, right? Beating people to death, pushing people into ovens, shooting people, standing over bodies like they were hunters. So you had a kind of Nazi top 10 list, in the museum, but out of respect for the sensibilities of survivors, that was it. So you had millions of people leading themselves to their death. That's not the story of the Holocaust. Perpetrators are a part of the story. And Sheike, in this case, made the decision, which I think was absolutely a correct one historically. You can't erase the perpetrators because you don't want them defiling the museum, right? They are a crucial part of the story. And the permanent exhibition now, of course, houses many, many photographs of perpetrators in all kinds of situations, clipping beards of Jews, beating people to death. In this case, the historical voice was seen as being crucial to the development of the story.
In that, taking that a little further, you talk about a little bit that some controversial issues were apparently left out. The role of Jewish councils, the capitals in the camps, and even perhaps the too neat lexicon of perpetrators, victims, bystanders. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, in every historical memory or systems of memory, there are indigestible stories. There are stories that are seen as either too difficult to tell, too painful to tell. The story of the capos, the story in any detail, the story of the Jewish councils, which is incredibly complex, and still people disagree violently disagree energetically about this today. I was not part of the discussions about why these didn't become a more significant part of the narrative, but they're difficult. Now, there are different memory systems in a museum. There's more than just a permanent exhibition. There is a wonderful bookstore at the Holocaust Museum. So the permanent exhibition is a kind of central thing, but other stories that are seen as being too difficult or painful to tell in a permanent exhibition are certainly present in Holocaust history and historiography in the bookstore. But this is an issue, you know, in all kinds of places, not just at the museum. The divisions of perpetrators, bystanders, and victims is a very helpful one in terms of a general sorting. But, you know, Primo Levi's understanding of the gray zones, right? That these are not so clean as they might seem, that there are layer upon layer upon layer in each one of these categories. Again, I think you can gesture to these things in a permanent exhibition, but an exhibition in a museum is not an encyclopedia and it's not a book. Why these decisions were made, I don't know.
Can you give me just a general sense of the capos and councils? What was their crimes, or what, in essence?
Well, the capos were very often Jews who you know, kept themselves alive by being among the brutal perpetrators that Nazis used in the camps, and they eventually, of course, were mostly put to death as well. The Jewish councils in various ghetto cities like Warsaw and Łódź and other places, there's tremendous controversy about those. It would be best for you to talk to, you know, a real Holocaust historian about that. But it had to do with how much do you accommodate the Nazis over a period of time? And do you hope that by accommodation you will save the community, right? And so do you energetically provide quotas for trains, hoping that you can save people who aren't on the trains? So were the Judenrat, were the Jewish councils sort of complicit in carrying out, even though they were in, you know, incredibly difficult positions, sort of choiceless choices in a way. But again, there are other people that can talk with you about that more than I can.
Do you have any perspectives or knowledge on the security guard who got murdered in the last year? You
No.
You have known nothing about that?
Well, again, this would be good to talk with somebody at the museum about. My understanding is that this was someone who was a white supremacist and anti-Semite, and you know, it was a horrific tragedy that I know from friends at the museum deeply, deeply affected people who worked there.
Okay. Do you know why I was given permission to photograph there. I was there last week, but the rank and file visitors can't photograph, or you know, you can't walk around and take pictures. Do you know anything about the reasoning behind that?
Lots of museums don't allow photographs to be taken. I think part of it is just it's irritating to have flash bulbs going off and on. You need to talk with them about the other reasons.
Do you have any knowledge? Like there was one series of images of tattoos, and I was told the photographer doesn't allow anybody to take pictures. Do you know anything about the politics of all
I
that?
don't. I don't.
Could you discuss, do we have a little more time?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Could you discuss the artifact collection? There was some controversies or issues about that?
Yes, well, when Ray Farr became the director of the permanent exhibition in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I can't remember. You can look in the book for when that was. She discovered really that. Let me start that over again, if I can. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Start the answer over. As the museum was being developed, several directors of the permanent exhibition discovered to their dismay that the material evidence of the Holocaust simply wasn't there. They had what GIs had brought back, you know, small things in their pockets and so on. But the material remnants of the Holocaust. I mean, material culture gives a reality to events. Simply wasn't there. And so teams from the museum went to Eastern Europe and Western Europe looking for large artifacts to bring back. A rail car of the type used to take Jews to Treblinka, to the death camp. A vat of shoes, a part of a women's barrack from Auschwitz, a prisoner's uniform, suitcases with names on them, thousands of pairs of eyeglasses, so forth and so on. That artifacts help people touch the realities to which they point to. I mean, this is one of the things museums do, right, is to connect people through material realities to the events or the people to which they speak. And the collections of these things were massive undertakings in any number of different countries. And often when these artifacts arrived in the United States, often through the port of Baltimore, the arrivals became occasions for rituals of remembrance on the docks themselves. And the museum had to be literally remodeled when the rail car came, as it did kind of late, to put in a new and stronger floor, and then the rail car was dropped in, by a crane. There was certainly discomfort over certain kinds of artifacts, like an empty can of Zyklon B gas. Some people thought that these were things that never should have been brought to the United States, right? There was almost a, symbolic toxic presence to these kinds of things. My feeling is that, they do convey a kind of material reality that you do see if you go to the camps, but the museum is a kind of outpost of Holocaust memory. The artifacts become very important, right, to Americans, to visitors to the museum who may never go to Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. May I ask you, what is the importance of these themes of resistance and righteous Gentiles? That loomed up large in the discussions about how to frame the museum, correct?
The stories of resistance, there were a number of different themes, throughout the museum. The final film in the museum is an hour and 17-minute, I believe, film that focuses on the themes of resistance, of spiritual resistance, of heroism, of defiance. And the stories do touch on those in some very, very powerful ways. But the stories and the faces of the people also subvert those very themes as they're talking about them. When you see people talking about a Polish woman who hid this family for a long period of time, right, and served them kosher food during that time, but then said, please don't come back to thank me, my Polish brethren will never forgive me for saving the life of a Jew. And these people never got a chance to say thank you, right, that it was a story unfinished. When people say, well, we prayed to God. For what? So there, faith and despair, at the same time. There were so many of these incredibly powerful stories that did talk about resistance, that did talk about heroism, but not in a simple way at all, that raised tremendously profound questions about those same topics. It was, I think, a stunning way to end the story in the museum.
We've talked about this a bit, but I'd like to hit it at this angle too, because I think it's important. And Wiesel?
Elie Wiesel.
He states the universality of the Holocaust lies in its uniqueness. And we've discussed it. Could you elaborate that quote for me, please, and help me get a better handle of that kind of paradigm? as you understand it?
You know, excuse me.
I don't expect you to be an expert on him, but I'm just wondering if you have any insights into that.
You know, I would ramble if I would rather you ask Michael.
I'm gonna try and ask him.
Yeah.
You know,
He'll be much more eloquent. Let me just think for a minute.
but it seems kind of the core of that perspective, and he was so influential in the museum. Seems like an
Well,
important quote.
I think part of it, the uniqueness of the Holocaust lies in its universality. Is that what? Say that again, please.
Essentially, the universality of the Holocaust lies in its uniqueness.
The universality of the Holocaust lies in its uniqueness. Well, I can't speak for Elie Wiesel, nor am I anywhere near as eloquent. I think part of what that means is that the Holocaust is an eruption in the middle of the 20th century in Western Europe of a genocidal process that is a warning to the rest of us living in an age when technological development makes possible genocide on a planetary scale. That that the whole world, he once said, has become Jewish after the Holocaust. That it is unique, but is a miner's canary for the rest of us. It means that, at least in part, I think.
You made reference in the book that he has was it a Haredim or Orthodox background? Do you know about that? This is obscure again.
He comes from a Hasidic background in Romania,
Okay.
I believe. Yeah.
I'll look into that. Could you discuss the issues over how to represent mass murder? You talked about nakedness, various...
Well, yeah, this is, you know, the issue of how to represent mass murder, genocide in a museum is a difficult one, I think. And Scheike Weinberg was very conscientious and careful to think about, for example, the implications of nudity. Do you display genitalia? I mean, do you victimize people again by doing that? Particularly given that most of the photographs, as a visitor to the museum, you're looking at these people through the eyes of a perpetrator taking the photograph, right? So the gaze is one of the Nazis, that you're looking at these people, right, as objects, as bodies. I mean, the same is true, isn't it, of, say, many photographs of lynchings? Well, who's taking those photographs and for what reason? And that's the view you're looking through. I mean, you become kind of in league with the perpetrator, looking through that same lens. What impact does that have on your ability to see this as a human being that has a name, that has a story, that has a family, not just an emaciated body standing before you that is just a flat body that's, you know, a victim. So Scheike was very careful about that. There are photographs of nudity in the museum, but they're small ones. They're not, if I'm remembering correctly, you know, huge ones at all. So, you know, the use of photographs in any museum that deals with these kinds of issues, there are, you know, representational violations that one really has to think carefully about. Do you victimize people again by showing them only in the stage at which they have been reduced by perpetrators to a human form that is not recognizable to you.
Do you know, as an aside, do you know anything about the lampshade, human skin lampshade controversy?
I know about the controversy. I don't know where people are on that today.
Okay. So, as far as the museum is concerned, there was controversy over showing graphic depictions of dead people. And
Well, no, there was controversy over everything, right from the building to the permanent exhibition to the relationship of Jews and other victims. Over artifacts, over photographs, and controversy doesn't mean that something is wrong. Controversy means that things are at stake, and the discussions, the conversations, the decisions that were made at every step were the product of intensely powerful processes at the museum. I mean, when I walked in to the offices on at 2000 L Street before people moved to the museum offices when it was done, the intensity of the project was unlike anything I've ever experienced before. And I could be there from 9 in the morning till 9 at night and sort of be sorry to have to go back to the hotel and sleep, because there was a sense of tremendous stakes of people fiercely and deeply convicted that they had to do this the right way, you know, and that it wasn't so easy to do it the right way, or at certain points to even know what the right way was. What's the right photograph? What's the right artifact? What's the right text? What's the right way to take visitors? Do we have a donor's wall? Do we put cushions on chairs in the middle of the permanent exhibition? All of these things registered as razor's edge issues in the museum, and it's why the biography of this place was so fascinating.
You mentioned this a bit, but I'd like to hit it from another angle. This Howard Husock, you quote him as saying this was a use of ethnic power politics in American political system, and it's a surefire way to spotlight day in and day out the historic justification of a Jewish state before Congress and whites. All that. Could you discuss that?
Well, we've already really talked about that. I mean, this is another example of someone saying that they believe the primary motivation for the museum being there was the political uses for the Carter administration. And again, I've said that, yeah, that's one of the reasons why the museum is there amidst many, many others.
Okay. How about controversies in the design of the building? Well,
the controversies over the design, remember, first the controversy is, well, what should we do? Then, okay, we're going to do a memorial/museum of some kind. Well, what city is it going to be in? Well, maybe New York, maybe here, maybe there. Well, then Washington. Well, where in Washington? Adjacent to the Washington Mall. Will the buildings that are there that reminded people of the barracks at Auschwitz, agriculture buildings, will they work? Well, no, they're too small. And Raoul Hilberg says, well, if the buildings are too small, so too will be our memory. So they're delisted from the historic register. And a number of different building proposals are looked at. None of them seem quite right. And then James Ingo Fried from Paycobb and Fried, himself a Jew whose family left Europe, decides that he would take this on. And he, like everyone else, goes to Eastern Europe and goes to the camps and is profoundly affected. Comes back and is convinced that the building can't just be a big black box, right? A neutral thing in which everything important happens inside. The building has to reflect the event. The building has to somehow give you a clue to the story, right? And so he creates what many people think is just this brilliant, brooding building that brings you to the center of American Memorial Space, adjacent to the Washington Mall, and the location of the building gives you a clue to the importance of its memory, right? If it was next to a Burger King in Virginia, it's not he's going to give you a different clue than at the center of American Memorial Space, touching against the mall. But then when you enter the building, you're not in American space anymore. You're in this industrial, brick, brooding building that never quite lets you go where you want to go. You have twisted skylights. You're further removed by taking an elevator to the 4th floor. None of the windows anywhere give you a clear view of the Washington Mall. So the entire way in which the building, it brings you to Washington, and then it takes you away from Washington, right, into Holocaust space, is really quite an experience. And I remember going through parts of the building as it was being built with Jim Freed and him talking about the building. But I was fascinated, with this deep conviction that he had that the building had to appropriately embody the story that it was going to tell inside.
Could I ask you about you talk about the public, there was no public announcement or public hearing on the land transfer, and that turned into controversy. Do you remember that?
There were some grumblings about how quickly the site was delisted from the historic register, but this was not any major, this didn't turn out to be any kind of enduring issue at all.
Okay. And there was some Philadelphia focus group. Peter, do you recall this? They did some, they were hired by the council to analyze public reaction to the museum and its permanent exhibition in 1992, and it said the museum should be in Germany or Austria where these things happen.
Well, here was, again, the philosophical debate that began when the museum was being envisioned. How does Holocaust memory belong in America? Does it belong in an institution? Is it an American memory? And some people said, well, no, there should be Holocaust museums in Germany and Poland and elsewhere in Europe and in Israel, not in the United States. Again, other people said, well, no, we don't think that's right. American GIs were there. They came back. Thousands of displaced persons who were in camps, many of them Jewish, came to the United States as other groups who emigrated to the United States brought their memories here. So have those people who have come from the camps. So have those GIs who have come back from Europe. So have those reporters like Edward R. Murrow and others who encountered the camps. So did people like Eisenhower and Patton and others who were at the camps. So that was the sort of philosophical divide right from the beginning. Yes, this is an American memory and needs to be, placed in an official United States institution. No, it's a memory out of place. We need to remember, if we're going to remember the indigestible events of history, we need to remember our own, slavery, so forth and so on, not the Holocaust.
Could you discuss the Americanization of the Holocaust, what that term infers and means? You've touched on it a bit.
Well, it's really sort of almost everything we've been talking about. How do you tell the story of the Holocaust and have American audiences connect to it? So you tell the story of changing immigration policy, you tell the story of SS St. Louis, you talk about memory of GIs who went and came back, you talk about thousands of displaced persons who came to the United States and their Holocaust memories become part of American memory. You talk about the Holocaust as an example of a case in which democracy and the rule of law completely fall apart and the establishment of totalitarian and genocidal societies. Again, Michael Berenbaum, who really kind of coined that phrase, is somebody that would be great to talk to about that.